They say time heals everything. But I've learned that time doesn't heal betrayal. It just teaches you how to hide the scars. My name is Clara Jennings. And when I was 38, my world collapsed in a way that felt almost surgical. Not sudden. Not loud, but precise. As if someone who knew me intimately had studied the exact point where my heart would break cleanly in two. I used to believe I understood pain. My father's passing when I was 23. The miscarriage at 30. The quiet years that followed those moments hurt. Yes, but they didn't destroy me. What destroyed me came later. Wrapped in the face of someone I trusted more than anyone else, my sister. We were only 2 years apart. Mara was the charming one. The golden girl of the family, the kind of woman who could walk into a room and draw every gaze without saying a word. I was the quiet one. The one people called reliable. She got the spotlight. I made sure the lights stayed on. For most of my life, that dynamic didn't bother me. I told myself we balanced each other. I was the anchor, she was the wind. But anchors don't realize how heavy they are until the ship cuts the rope. It started 3 years ago. The day I inherited my parents' house, a weathered 2-story by the lake. The one my father built himself after returning from the service. Every board carried his patience. Every nail. His promise that family was something you built, not something you borrowed. When he died, he left it to me. Not because he loved me more, but because, as he used to say, you'll take care of it the way I did. Mara didn't take that well. She smiled at the will reading, hugged me afterward, and told me she understood. But I caught the flicker in her eyes. That quick, almost imperceptible tremor of resentment. I ignored it, because that's what I did. I forgave. She moved in temporarily after her divorce, saying she needed space to breathe. I said yes, because how could I say no to my only sister? We spent those first few weeks like we used to as kids, cooking late-night pancakes, watching old movies, laughing about our father's terrible jokes. It felt almost normal. Almost. But something subtle had shifted. She began inviting people over, friends I didn't know. Men who looked at her the way she liked to be seen, with attention that glimmered and vanished fast. I would come home from work and find cigarette smoke in the kitchen, half-empty wine glasses on the counter, and a smile on her face that didn't reach her eyes. "You don't mind, do you?" she'd ask, already knowing I wouldn't say no. That was the pattern. Mara would take, and I would allow, because saying no to her always felt like betrayal, even when she was the one betraying me. The real fracture came on a quiet Sunday morning. She'd been gone all night again, and I found her sitting on the porch steps when I came back from the market. She looked exhausted. Mascara smudged. Her hands trembling around a cup of cold coffee. "There's something I need to tell you," she said. It turned out she wasn't just seeing someone. She was seeing Ethan. My Ethan. The man I had spent 5 years loving, waiting for, forgiving. The man who'd promised we were just taking a break while he sorted out his life. I remember laughing when she said it. A sound that didn't belong to me. "You're joking," I said. But she wasn't. She looked at me with pity and said, "It just happened. Clara, I didn't plan it." That phrase, "I didn't plan it," would echo in my head for months. She said she wanted to tell me before I heard it from someone else. As if that would make the knife any cleaner. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just walked into the house, locked myself in my father's old study, and stared at the blueprint of his hands framed above the desk, the one that said "Integrity builds homes." It took me 3 hours to stop shaking. By nightfall, she was gone. She left a note saying she'd move out to give me space, as if space could undo what she'd done. But that wasn't the end. 2 months later, I got a call from my aunt in town. "Have you seen the papers?" she asked. Mara and Ethan bought property together, lakefront. Said it's for a renovation project. My stomach dropped. The only lakefront property left unsold was our family's adjoining lot, the one she'd begged to help me manage. When I checked the records, I saw her name and mine. She had transferred half the deed into her business account without my consent. A signature forged so precisely it fooled the registrar. That was the moment something inside me cracked open. Not from heartbreak, from clarity. For the first time in my life, I stopped asking why she did it. I started asking how I would end it. I didn't call the police. Not yet. I needed to understand the full extent of what she'd taken, not just property, but trust, memory, even my father's legacy. I started digging. I combed through bank records, emails, property transfers. What I found wasn't just fraud, it was orchestration. Ethan had helped her. He'd been the silent partner funding her boutique renovation firm, which was now bleeding money. They'd used my inheritance as collateral for their debt. Every late-night conversation I'd overheard, every time she'd brushed off a phone call, every smile that didn't reach her eyes, all of it clicked into place like a cruel puzzle I'd been too loyal to see. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark, watching the reflection of the lake through the window, the same lake that held our childhood summers, our laughter, our father's ashes. It looked still from the surface, but I knew beneath it, everything moved slow and dangerous. That was how revenge began for me, not as fury, but as stillness. The next day, I called a lawyer friend, someone who owed me a favor. We reviewed the documents quietly, methodically. "You could press charges," he said, "but if you want this done right, if you want it to hurt, you'll need to be patient." Patience. The one thing I'd always had. I started recording everything. Calls, messages, bank notices. I played the fool, answered her texts with gentle replies, acted as though I was moving on. When she asked to meet and talk, I agreed. We met at the old cafe near the harbor, the one where Dad used to take us after Sunday service. She arrived late, glowing in the way only guilt-free people do. "You look good," she said. "So do you." I lied. She talked about her new business, how things were finally looking up, how Ethan was helping her get back on her feet. She said it like she was confessing something tender, not monstrous. When she mentioned the new house ours, she called it, my pulse slowed to a dangerous calm. I told her I was happy for her. I even reached across the table, squeezed her hand, and said, "Dad would be proud that you're building something." She smiled, relieved, grateful, stupidly unaware, because by then, I'd already started dismantling it all. That night, I sent anonymous tips to the bank's audit department and the local building council. I reported inconsistencies in permit signatures, discrepancies in business accounts, even anonymous photos of the forged deed. I didn't need to expose her yet. I just needed the cracks to form. And when they did, when her calls began to sound desperate, when Ethan stopped answering her texts, when she came back to the house begging for just a little help, that was when I realized something profound. She had taken everything she thought mattered. Money, property, love. But the one thing she could never fake was conscience. And that, slowly, was what began to eat her alive. Revenge wasn't loud. It was quiet, methodical, inevitable. And I wasn't done yet. The first domino had fallen, and I could almost hear the faint sound of their world cracking. Mara's texts started flooding in 2 days later. First polite, then pleading. "Hey, can we talk?" turned into Clara. "Please. I think someone's reporting us. I need help." I read them all in silence. Each message a tiny monument to her panic. I didn't reply. I wanted her to feel it, the same weight of helplessness she'd once handed to me. But revenge, I learned, isn't always satisfying. Sometimes, it's exhausting. Every morning I'd wake up to new messages. New rumors. Their business permit was under review. The investors pulled out. Ethan's name appeared on an online forum where people whispered about financial fraud. I didn't have to push anymore. The cracks I'd made were spreading on their own. Then, one night, she showed up at my door, I hadn't seen her in months. The woman on my porch barely resembled the sister I'd grown up with. Her hair was unwashed, her makeup smeared, her voice trembling. "Clara," she whispered. "Please. I don't know what's happening. Ethan left. The bank froze our accounts. I think someone's trying to ruin me." I almost laughed at the irony. But instead, I opened the door. I didn't do it out of kindness. I did it out of curiosity. I wanted to see what guilt looked like up close. She sat at the kitchen table, fingers tracing invisible patterns on the wood. "You have to believe me," she said. "I didn't mean for things to go this far." There it was again. I didn't mean to. I leaned against the counter, studying her like a stranger. "You forged my signature. Mara, you lied to me. You stole our father's house. Tell me, which part of that wasn't intentional?" Her eyes filled. But I didn't move. For once, I wanted her to sit in the discomfort she'd spent her life escaping. "I thought I could fix it before you found out," she said, voice cracking. Ethan said I cut her off. Ethan used you the way you used me. That's the difference. You both thought you were smarter than the person who loved you." The silence between us thickened until it felt suffocating. "Finally," she said. "What do you want me to do, Beg?" I looked at her. And for a fleeting second, I saw the girl. She'd been the one who used to sneak into my bed after nightmares. The one who'd once promised we'd always take care of each other. But the truth was simpler now. "I don't want anything from you," I said. "That's the point." She left without another word. The next morning, news broke that the renovation company she'd started with Ethan had filed for bankruptcy. Investigators were probing financial misconduct, forged permits, missing funds. I didn't have to lift another finger. Karma had learned her name. Still, something in me stayed restless. Because revenge doesn't erase pain, it just redistributes it. I wanted closure. Not headlines. So I drove to the lake house, the one she'd tried to take. It was empty now. Quiet, except for the wind brushing against the windows. Dust had settled on everything on the floors. The mantel. The framed photo of Dad smiling at a younger version of us. I stood there for a long time, remembering how he used to say, "A home is just wood and stone until you fill it with honesty." I realized then that he'd built more than a house, he'd built a test. And we had failed it. That night, I sat on the porch steps watching the lake shimmer under the moonlight. My reflection looked older, steadier, the kind of woman who had learned to survive her own kindness. I didn't see Mara again for months. She disappeared. Rumors said she left town. That Ethan fled overseas. I didn't care to verify either. The silence they left behind was the most honest thing they'd ever given me. But one morning in late spring, an envelope arrived. No return address. Just my name. Inside was a single page written in her handwriting. "I know you did this. But I don't hate you. I understand now. Maybe we both needed to lose everything to see who we really were. I'm sorry it took me so long to mean that. No threats. No blame. Just that." I read it once. Twice. And folded it carefully into my journal. For the first time since the fire she'd lit in my life, I didn't feel rage. I felt release. It was strange. The way peace sneaks up on you not as forgiveness, but as indifference, the kind that lets you breathe again. I started spending weekends repairing the house myself, small things at first. Repainting the porch, fixing the shutters, clearing out Dad's workshop. The rhythm of restoration became my therapy. Each nail I hammered, each wall I sanded down, felt like reclaiming something they'd tried to take. Neighbors began stopping by, offering help. One of them, a quiet man named Henry, worked as a carpenter. He offered to help rebuild the dock that had rotted over the years. We spent afternoons working in companionable silence, sharing small stories between the sound of hammers and waves. He never asked about Mara or Ethan, though I could tell he knew. Small towns have long memories, but he treated me like someone rebuilding a life, not escaping a ruin. One evening, as we finished for the day, he looked at the lake and said, "Funny thing about water, no matter how much you stir it up, it always finds a way to settle again." I smiled. Maybe people can too. For the first time in a long time, I meant it. That night, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I lit one of Dad's old lanterns and placed it at the edge of the dock. Its reflection shimmered across the water. Trembling, but steady, I whispered, "It's done." Not to Mara, not to Ethan, but to the version of me who had needed revenge to feel whole. Because I wasn't her anymore. I wasn't the quiet sister or the forgiving daughter or the woman who waited for others to see her worth. I was the woman who survived the fire and learned how to build from the ashes. And in that stillness, I finally understood what my father had meant. Integrity doesn't just build homes. It rebuilds you. Winter came quietly that year, wrapping the lake and hills in a fragile stillness. I remember standing by the window one morning, coffee in hand, watching the snow drift across the dock. Henry and I had rebuilt. The air smelled of pine and cold. And for the first time in a long time, the quiet didn't feel heavy. It felt deserved. But peace, I've learned, is never permanent. It's a pause between lessons. It was early February when a letter arrived, official-looking, thin but heavy. The kind of letter that carries something final inside it. It was from the state courthouse. My name was listed as an involved party in a civil hearing, Jennings v. Monroe Development Group. Monroe Development. Ethan's company. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake. The second was that I should have known better than to think men like him fade quietly into the background. When I called Marjorie, the lawyer who'd helped me before, she sighed the way people do when the past won't stay buried. "They're trying to liquidate assets tied to the fraudulent properties," she said. "They're claiming you still have joint financial responsibility because your name was forged on one of the original documents. They're using it as leverage to reopen the case." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The idea that I could be dragged back into their mess after everything felt like being pulled under the ice after finally learning to swim. Marjorie assured me she'd handle it, but her tone carried a weight I couldn't ignore. "They might try to settle quietly. Don't be surprised if Ethan reaches out." And he did. 3 days later, I came home to find a black car parked near the gate. He was standing by it, coat collar turned up against the wind, looking every bit as composed as he used to except for the eyes. His eyes were older, emptier, haunted by the kind of consequences he thought he could outrun. "Clara," he said, voice softer than I remembered. "You look good." I didn't invite him in. "You shouldn't be here." "I had to see you," he said. "They're twisting everything. I never meant for any of it to come back on you." I almost laughed. Never meant to. Those words again. That convenient absolution everyone clings to when the fire spreads too far. "You forged my name on contracts worth $500,000. I said. "I think intent stopped mattering a long time ago." He looked at me then, really looked. "You were always the careful one. I thought you'd figure it out before it got this bad." "I did," I said. "That's why you're standing here instead of in a penthouse." For a moment, the wind was the only sound between us. Then he said something that almost broke me again. "Mara's sick." The words hit harder than I wanted them to. "What do you mean?" "Liver failure. Late stage. She's in a facility upstate. She doesn't have anyone." I turned away. Because if I looked at him, I might have remembered the part of me that still cared. The part that always cared. He stepped closer. "She asked for you." I hated that my first instinct wasn't anger. It was grief. Grief for the girl she'd been before. Ambition devoured her. For the sister who used to braid my hair and whisper secrets under the blankets. But I also hated myself for hesitating. For letting guilt sneak in where peace had finally started to grow. That night, I couldn't sleep. The lake outside was frozen solid. moonlight glittering across it like glass. I thought about how easily things shatter, how forgiveness, like ice, can look strong until it cracks beneath your weight. By dawn, I'd made my choice. The drive upstate took 3 hours through winding roads and forests that looked like paintings. The facility was quiet, too clean. The kind of place that tries to disguise despair with soft lighting and the smell of disinfectant. When I entered her room, I almost didn't recognize her. Mara looked smaller, her skin pale against the white sheets. Her once perfect hair was gone, replaced by a scarf that couldn't hide the hollowness of her face. When she saw me, she smiled, weak but real. "You came." I stood by the door for a long time before moving closer. I wasn't sure I would. She nodded. "I wouldn't have. Either." We didn't speak for several minutes. The only sound was the faint hum of the oxygen machine. "I heard about the lawsuit," she said finally. "Ethan told me. I told him not to bother you. You should have thought of that before you both forged my name," I said quietly. Her lips trembled, but she didn't argue. "I know. I've thought about it every day. I didn't think the cost would be this high." I sat down, not because I forgave her, but because I couldn't stand anymore. "You thought you could take everything and walk away clean. That's what both of you thought." She nodded again, tears slipping down her face. "I did, and I was wrong. You were always the stronger one, Clara. I just didn't want to admit it." It was strange hearing her say that the same sister who once told me I'd never make it without her charm, her daring, airlight. For a moment, I didn't know what to feel. Pity, anger, relief, maybe all of it. She reached out, her hand trembling. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I just needed you to know I'm sorry. For everything. For Ethan. For Dad's house. For being your sister and not your ally." The tears I'd buried for years finally broke free. I didn't say anything. I just held her hand. And for a few minutes, the silence between us didn't feel like punishment. It felt like peace. When I left, she was asleep. I stood by the door and whispered, "You were my sister before you were my mistake. Rest now." Outside, the snow had started again, soft, almost weightless. Ethan was waiting by his car when I returned. "How was she?" "Dying," I said bluntly, and honest for once. He nodded, eyes wet. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness either." "You don't," I said, "but maybe she does." He didn't reply. When I walked away, he didn't try to stop me. The case was dismissed 2 months later. Turns out, Mara had quietly amended her statement before she passed, admitting full responsibility for the forged signatures. My name was cleared completely. When I got the call from Marjorie, I was sitting on the dock, watching the first hints of spring thaw the lake. I didn't cry. I just closed my eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Mara." It wasn't forgiveness. It was farewell. That summer, I turned 40. The house stood whole again, brighter than ever. Henry and I painted the porch railing, a soft cream color. Mom came to visit, bringing Dad's old tool belt, which she'd found in a box in the attic. "He'd want you to have this," she said. As I fastened it around my waist, I realized something profound. I hadn't just rebuilt a home. I'd rebuilt a legacy. That night, standing by the water, I felt the presence of everyone I'd lost: the father who taught me integrity, the sister who taught me resilience, the version of myself who'd finally learned to stop apologizing for surviving. And I smiled, because sometimes revenge isn't about destruction, it's about reclamation. Mara's death came quietly, like a candle snuffed out in another room. You don't see the darkness immediately. You just feel it spreading. I found out on a Wednesday morning. The facility called, their voices clinical and careful, as if grief were something they could hand over gently. "She passed in her sleep," they said. "No pain. I thanked them automatically, hung up, and stared at my coffee until it went cold. I should have cried. But tears didn't come. Not because I didn't care, but because I'd spent too many nights mourning her already years before her body gave up. Her choices had hollowed her out. Still, that day felt heavier than most. I drove to the lake, where everything had begun and ended. The surface was still, frozen in thin patches that cracked softly when the wind shifted. I thought about how fragile it looked, how easily something beautiful could split apart, under pressure just like us. I brought her letter with me, the one she'd written before dying. I read it again slowly, tracing each word with my thumb. And then I folded it neatly and tucked it under one of Dad's old rocks by the shore. She'd always hated endings. This one, at least, I could make gentle. In the following weeks, I settled her affairs, small things like signing release forms, collecting her few belongings. Among them was a photo I hadn't seen in decades, the two of us as children, barefoot in the yard, our father standing behind us, one arm around each shoulder. The sun behind us made everything look golden. I stared at it for a long time, realizing how grief can rewrite memory, how I had let betrayal eclipse years of love. That night, I placed the photo on the mantel beside Dad's framed blueprints. For once, it didn't ache to look at. Life after that began to feel quieter, not empty, but balanced. Henry and I kept working on the property, turning the guest cabin into a retreat for writers and artists, people looking for second chances. It felt symbolic, somehow transforming a space built from deception into a place that nurtured truth. I named it the Lantern House, after the light Dad used to leave on by the dock. We opened that fall. The first guests arrived shyly, carrying notebooks and cameras and the heavy silence of people learning how to start over. I recognized that silence. It was the same one that had once lived inside me. Sometimes, late at night, I'd walk the shoreline and see the reflection of the house lights rippling across the water. I'd think about all the ghosts I'd carried my father, Ethan, Mara, the woman I used to be, and I realized they weren't haunting me anymore. They were simply part of my story. One evening, as I watched the sunset fade, Henry joined me with 2 mugs of tea. "You know," he said quietly, "you've built something that feels like forgiveness." I smiled faintly. "I don't know if I believe in forgiveness." He shrugged. "Then call it freedom." Maybe he was right, because standing there, with the lake calm and the wind soft against my face, I realized freedom didn't come from forgetting. It came from remembering without breaking. Months later, a letter arrived from the state, the final notice closing all legal matters tied to Ethan and Mara's case. No further obligations or liabilities. It said, "Clean, complete." I read it once, then tore it into tiny pieces and let the wind carry them across the water. That night, I recorded a video for the Lantern House's website, just a short clip, welcoming visitors, sharing its story. But when I finished, I sat for a moment before the camera, hesitating. Then, without planning to, I spoke from the heart. I used to think survival meant fighting. I said softly, "But sometimes, it means surrendering not to defeat, but to the truth that people will hurt you. Sometimes the ones you love most, and that you can't control what they do, only what you build afterward." I paused, eyes burning. If you're watching this because you've been betrayed, or broken, or left behind, I want you to know something. You are not ruined. You are being rebuilt. Every scar is a blueprint. Every ending is the start of your own homecoming. I didn't mean for it to sound poetic. It was just true. The next morning, I posted it without editing. Within weeks, messages began to flood in, not just from guests, but from strangers around the world. People wrote about their own losses, their own rebuildings. One woman said she watched it every night before bed, just to remind herself that healing was possible. That's when I realized the story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever stood in the ruins and decided to start again. A year later, on the anniversary of Mara's death, I lit a lantern at the edge of the dock. The sky was full of stars, and the air carried the faint scent of pine and frost. I whispered her name, not in anger, but in gratitude, because without her betrayal, I might never have found the strength to become who I am now. As the lantern drifted away, its reflection shimmering across the dark water, I felt something lift from me. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the quiet one, or the forgiving one, or the broken one. I just felt whole. So if you've listened this far, thank you for hearing me, for walking through this story with me. If it stayed with you, if it reminded you that even betrayal can become rebirth, please, share, and subscribe. Tell me in the comments what moment resonated with your own journey. Because maybe that's how we heal, by turning our pain into something that lights the way for someone else.